The eviction notice trembled in Grace Miller's hands as she stood on the front porch of the small rental house she'd called home for 3 years. The red letters seemed to mock her. Final notice, 30 days to vacate. Behind her, she could hear 4-year-old Tyler playing with his toy trucks, blissfully unaware that their world was about to crumble once again. Grace folded the paper carefully, her fingers tracing the creases as if she could somehow make the words disappear. The morning sun cast long shadows across the modest neighborhood, and she could smell Mrs. Henderson's coffee brewing next door, a simple pleasure she might soon have to leave behind. Her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket, and she already knew it was another creditor, calling about the mounting medical bills from Tyler's emergency appendectomy 6 months ago. "Mommy, look!" Tyler's voice called from inside, filled with the kind of joy that only children could muster over the simplest things. "My truck can carry all my blocks." Grace managed a smile as she walked back inside, tucking the eviction notice into her purse beside a stack of other unpaid bills. The living room was sparse but clean, decorated with Tyler's artwork and a few family photos, the remnants of a life that had once held so much promise. Her ex-husband had left when Tyler was barely 2, claiming he wasn't ready for the responsibility, and since then, Grace had been fighting an uphill battle against poverty, working 2 jobs just to keep their heads above water. The irony wasn't lost on her that she held a business degree from a prestigious university. But when you're a single mother with no family support and a gap in your resume due to caring for a sick child, even waitressing jobs became competitive. Her current position at Miller's Diner paid barely above minimum wage, and her weekend job cleaning office buildings added just enough to cover groceries and utilities when there were no unexpected expenses. "Mrs. Miller!" The voice from the doorway made her jump. A tall man in an expensive suit stood silhouetted against the morning light, his presence immediately commanding attention. She'd never seen him before, but something about his confident posture and the way he surveyed their modest home made her instinctively protective. "Yes?" Grace moved closer to Tyler, who had stopped playing to stare at the stranger with wide, curious eyes. "I'm Marcus Wellington. I believe we have some business to discuss." The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it suggested it should. Marcus Wellington stepped inside without invitation, his dark eyes taking in every detail of their home with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating investments. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps mid-30s, with the kind of sharp features and impeccable grooming that spoke of wealth and power. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake," Grace said, instinctively stepping between the stranger and her son. "I don't know you, and I certainly don't have any business with you." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed her a photograph that made her blood run cold. It was her father, Richard Miller, shaking hands with a much older man in what appeared to be an expensive restaurant. The timestamp showed it was taken just 3 weeks ago. "Your father owes my family a considerable sum of money," Marcus said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being questioned. $2 million to be exact, money that was borrowed with very specific terms attached. Grace felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Her father had been out of her life for over 5 years, ever since her mother's funeral, when they'd had a bitter argument about his gambling debts and questionable business associates. She'd known he had problems, but $2 million was beyond anything she could have imagined. "That has nothing to do with me," she said firmly, though her voice betrayed her growing panic. "I haven't spoken to my father in years. Unfortunately, the contract he signed says otherwise." Marcus produced a thick folder from his briefcase, spreading several legal documents across her coffee table with practiced efficiency. "When he couldn't repay the loan, he offered your hand in marriage as collateral for an extended payment plan. A rather old-fashioned solution, I'll admit, but my grandfather was quite specific in his terms." The words hit Grace like physical blows. Marriage as collateral? In what century did this man think they were living? She stared at the documents, trying to make sense of the legal language that seemed to swim before her eyes. "This is insane," she whispered. "You can't just—" "People don't do this anymore. It's not legal. It can't be legal." "I'm afraid it is," Marcus replied, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation either. "The contract was witnessed and notarized. Your father signed away your right to refuse in exchange for a stay of execution on his debt. Quite literally, in this case." Tyler had abandoned his toys and was now clinging to Grace's leg, sensing the tension in the room, even if he couldn't understand the words. Grace's mind raced, trying to find some escape from this nightmare scenario. She thought of the eviction notice in her purse, the medical bills, the empty refrigerator she'd been planning to stock after her next paycheck. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Then my family will collect what's owed in other ways," Marcus said simply. "Your father made some very poor choices, Mrs. Miller. He borrowed money from people who always collect their debts one way or another." The implied threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Grace looked down at Tyler's trusting face, then back at the man who had just turned her world upside down. She was trapped, caught in a web of her father's making with no apparent way out. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she demanded. This could all be some elaborate scam. Marcus's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she caught a glimpse of something almost human beneath the corporate facade. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a number, putting it on speaker. "Richard, it's Marcus Wellington. I'm here with your daughter." Her father's voice, older and more defeated than she remembered, crackled through the speaker. "Grace, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to come to this, but I had no choice. These people, they would have killed me." The conversation that followed confirmed her worst fears. Her father had indeed signed a contract offering her in marriage to settle his debts, and the men he owed money to were not the kind to accept excuses or delays. The choice, it seemed, was between marrying a stranger and watching her father die, possibly placing herself and Tyler in danger as well. As Marcus ended the call and began gathering his documents, Grace felt the last of her illusions about having control over her life crumble away. She was about to ask when this supposed marriage was supposed to take place when Tyler tugged on her sleeve. "Mommy," he whispered loudly, "is the fancy man going to be my new daddy?" The innocent question hung in the air, and Grace saw something flicker across Marcus's face. Surprise, perhaps, or something that might have been regret. For the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed uncertain, as if he hadn't fully considered all the implications of his family's arrangement. The silence that followed Tyler's innocent question stretched uncomfortably between the three of them. Grace watched as Marcus Wellington's carefully composed expression faltered for just a moment, his dark eyes shifting from her to the small boy who was still clinging to her leg with the trust that only children possessed. "We need to discuss the terms," Marcus said finally, his voice noticeably softer than before. He glanced around the modest living room again, but this time his assessment seemed less calculating and more thoughtful. "Perhaps somewhere more private." Grace looked down at Tyler, who was still staring at Marcus with the unabashed curiosity of a 4-year-old. "Tyler, sweetheart, why don't you go play in your room for a little while? Take your trucks with you." "But I want to hear about the fancy man," Tyler protested, his lower lip jutting out in a pout that Grace knew all too well. "I'll explain everything later, I promise," she said, gently steering him toward the hallway. "Maybe you can build that big garage you were talking about." Tyler's face brightened at the prospect, and he gathered his toys with the single-minded focus that children brought to their favorite activities. Once she heard his bedroom door close, Grace returned to find Marcus standing by the window, staring out at the street with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You have a son," he said without turning around. It wasn't a question, but there was something in his tone that suggested this detail had complicated his plans. "Tyler is everything to me," Grace replied firmly. "Whatever this arrangement is supposed to be, he's not negotiable. I won't let him be hurt or confused or used as leverage." Marcus turned to face her, and she was surprised to see what looked like genuine concern in his eyes. "I wouldn't dream of harming a child, but you need to understand, this isn't just about a marriage certificate. My grandfather's will specifies that the union must appear legitimate for at least 1 year. That means living together, public appearances, convincing people that we're actually committed to each other." The reality of what he was describing hit Grace like a physical blow. A year of pretending to be married to this stranger, of disrupting Tyler's life, of living a lie that could fall apart at any moment. She sank onto the couch, suddenly feeling exhausted despite the early hour. "Tell me about your grandfather," she said quietly. "Why would someone write such a condition into a will?" Marcus's expression darkened, and he began pacing the small room like a caged animal. Vincent Wellington was old school in the worst possible ways. He believed that business deals should be sealed with personal stakes, that money meant nothing if people weren't willing to risk something they actually cared about. "When your father approached him for the loan, my grandfather saw an opportunity to, let's say, teach me a lesson about responsibility." "What kind of lesson?" "That I need to settle down," start a family, stop what he called my reckless bachelor lifestyle. Marcus's voice carried a bitter edge. He died 6 months ago, but not before making sure his will tied my inheritance to fulfilling this particular obligation. If I don't go through with the marriage, the family business goes to my cousin Derek, someone who would run it into the ground within a year. Grace studied his face, beginning to understand that Marcus Wellington might be as trapped in this situation as she was. What kind of business are we talking about? Wellington Industries. We own hotels, restaurants, shipping companies. About 40,000 employees worldwide depend on our decisions. He stopped pacing and looked directly at her. I won't let Derek destroy what 3 generations of my family built just because I refuse to play my grandfather's games. The scope of what he was describing was almost impossible for Grace to comprehend. 40,000 employees, more people than lived in her entire town. The responsibility of that many livelihoods resting on his shoulders suddenly made Marcus Wellington seem less like an arrogant stranger and more like someone carrying an enormous burden. So we're both trapped, she said softly. It appears so. Marcus sat down across from her, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he seemed to shed some of his corporate armor. But I want you to know that I'll do everything I can to make this bearable for you and your son. You'll live in my penthouse, which has plenty of space and a view Tyler might enjoy. I'll cover all expenses, including any medical bills or debts you currently have. And when the year is over, you'll receive a settlement that will ensure you never have to worry about money again. The offer was generous, more generous than Grace had any right to expect, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. What aren't you telling me? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his knee in what she was beginning to recognize as a nervous habit. There's a social aspect to this arrangement that you need to be prepared for. Wellington Industries is very much in the public eye. There will be charity galas, business dinners, interviews with lifestyle magazines. You'll need to learn to navigate that world convincingly. Grace felt a familiar surge of panic. The idea of being scrutinized by high society, of having to pretend sophistication she didn't possess, was terrifying. I'm not exactly socialite material, she said, gesturing to her worn jeans and simple sweater. That can be addressed, Marcus replied, though his tone suggested he was already mentally calculating the challenges involved. Personal shoppers, etiquette coaches, whatever you need. The important thing is that we present a united front. And Tyler? Grace asked, the most important question of all. He'll have the best of everything. Private school, tutors, health care that will make sure he never has to worry about medical bills again. I may not know much about children, but I understand the importance of stability and security. The promise was appealing, more appealing than Grace wanted to admit. Tyler deserved opportunities she'd never been able to give him, and the financial security Marcus was offering would eliminate the constant stress that had been her companion for years. But there was still something that didn't make sense. Why haven't you just hired an actress? She asked. Surely someone in your position could find a woman willing to play the role without all the complications of my father's debt. Marcus's expression became unreadable again. My grandfather was very specific. It had to be you, Grace Miller. He investigated your father's situation thoroughly before agreeing to the loan. He knew about you, about Tyler, about your circumstances. In his mind, this arrangement served multiple purposes. It got him a daughter-in-law he considered suitable and gave you a way out of poverty. The revelation that she'd been researched and evaluated like a business investment was unsettling, but it also raised new questions. Suitable how? You have a college degree, but you've been working service jobs to support your son. You're not after money or status, you're just trying to survive. My grandfather respected that kind of determination. Marcus paused, his expression softening slightly. From what I've observed this morning, I think his assessment was accurate. Grace wasn't sure whether to be flattered or insulted by this clinical evaluation of her character. Before she could respond, Tyler's voice called out from his bedroom, "Mommy, I finished my garage. Can the fancy man come see?" The innocent enthusiasm in her son's voice reminded Grace of what was really at stake here. This wasn't just about her pride or her comfort. It was about Tyler's future, his security, his chances at a life she could never provide on her own. "We'll need to tell him something," she said quietly. "We'll figure it out together," Marcus replied, and something in his voice suggested that he meant it. "This doesn't have to be adversarial, Grace. We're both intelligent adults facing an impossible situation. Maybe we can find a way to make it work for everyone involved." As if summoned by their conversation, Tyler appeared in the doorway. his face bright with excitement and his hands covered in the kind of creative mess that came from ambitious building projects. He looked between Grace and Marcus with the expectant expression of a child who assumed all adults shared his enthusiasm for toy trucks and block constructions. "Can you come see my garage now?" he asked Marcus directly, apparently having decided that anyone his mother was talking to for this long must be worth knowing. Grace watched as Marcus Wellington, billionaire CEO and reluctant groom, looked down at her 4-year-old son and seemed to realize that this arrangement was going to be far more complicated than any business deal he'd ever negotiated. 3 weeks later, Grace stood in the marble foyer of Marcus Wellington's penthouse, watching Tyler's eyes grow wide as he took in the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. The moving truck had just left, taking with it the few possessions they'd brought from their old life, mostly Tyler's toys and Grace's small collection of books and family photos. "Mommy, is this really where we're going to live?" Tyler whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. He was clutching his favorite stuffed elephant, Peanut, and Grace could see the mixture of excitement and uncertainty in his expression. "For a while." "Yes," Grace replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The past 3 weeks had been a whirlwind of legal paperwork, quiet courthouse wedding ceremony, with only Tyler and Marcus's lawyer as witnesses, and crash courses in everything from wine tasting to proper table settings. She still felt like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. Marcus emerged from what she assumed was his home office, having shed his suit jacket for a more casual button-down shirt that somehow made him seem more approachable. Over the past weeks, Grace had begun to notice small details about him. The way he unconsciously straightened his tie when he was thinking, how he always held doors open without making a show of it, the genuine patience he'd shown when Tyler had peppered him with questions during their few interactions. "Tyler, would you like to see your new room?" Marcus asked, his tone carefully neutral. Grace had noticed that he seemed unsure how to interact with her son, as if children were a foreign species he'd never encountered before. Tyler nodded enthusiastically and followed Marcus down a hallway lined with expensive artwork that Grace was fairly certain cost more than she'd earned in the past 5 years combined. She trailed behind them, still feeling like an intruder in this pristine world of marble and crystal. The room Marcus showed them made Tyler gasp with delight. It was enormous by their old standards, with its own bathroom and a reading nook by the window. But what really captured Tyler's attention was the elaborate train set that dominated one corner of the room, complete with mountains, bridges, and a small village populated with tiny figures. "Is that day for me?" Tyler asked, his voice hushed with awe. "If you'd like it," Marcus replied, and Grace caught something almost vulnerable in his expression as he watched Tyler's reaction. "I wasn't sure what 4-year-olds enjoyed, so I may have overcompensated." Tyler was already kneeling beside the train set, his eyes following the intricate track layout with the intense focus he brought to anything mechanical. "Can I make it go?" "Of course." Marcus showed him the control panel, and within moments the room filled with the sound of tiny trains chugging along their tracks. Tyler's delighted laughter was the most natural sound this elegant apartment had probably ever heard. Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her son's joy, but also a growing unease about the disparity between this world and the one they'd left behind. How was she supposed to explain to Tyler that this was temporary, that in a year they'd go back to worrying about rent and grocery money? "He seems to approve," Marcus said quietly, appearing beside her as Tyler became absorbed in exploring the train set's various features. "He's never had anything like this," Grace admitted. "I'm worried about what happens when the year is over," Marcus finished. "We don't have to make those decisions now." There was something in his tone that made her look at him more closely. Over the past weeks, she'd begun to realize that Marcus Wellington was more complex than his corporate facade suggested. He'd been unfailingly polite and considerate, but she'd also caught glimpses of something else, a loneliness that seemed to mirror her own, moments when his careful control slipped just enough to reveal someone who seemed as uncertain about this arrangement as she was. Their conversation was interrupted by Tyler's excited voice. "Marcus, the little people in the village moved too." The use of Marcus's first name was new, and Grace saw something shift in Marcus's expression, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. He'd been Mr. Wellington for the first few meetings, but Tyler had gradually worn down his formality with the persistent friendliness that only children could manage. "They do indeed," Marcus said, walking over to kneel beside Tyler. And if you press this button, the drawbridge goes up and down. As Grace watched the two of them examine the train set together, Marcus pointing out various features, while Tyler provided an enthusiastic running commentary, she felt the strangest sensation. For just a moment, they looked like a family. The thought was dangerous and foolish, but she couldn't shake it. Her phone rang, interrupting the domestic scene. The caller ID made her stomach clench. Dr. Patterson's office. Tyler's pediatrician had been monitoring some concerning symptoms that had developed over the past month. Fatigue, occasional fevers, bruising that seemed to appear without cause. "Excuse me," she said, stepping into the hallway to take the call. "Mrs. Miller, this is Dr. Patterson. I have Tyler's blood work results and I'd like you to bring him in as soon as possible." The careful neutrality in the doctor's voice sent ice through Grace's veins. "What's wrong?" "I'd rather discuss this in person, but Tyler's white blood cell count is elevated and there are some other indicators that concern me. I've already spoken with a pediatric hematologist at Children's Hospital and she can see Tyler tomorrow morning." Hematologist, blood specialist. Grace's medical knowledge was limited, but she knew enough to understand that this wasn't about a simple infection or vitamin deficiency. She gripped the phone tighter, trying to keep her voice steady. "Should I be worried?" "Let's just say I want to rule out some possibilities as quickly as possible," Dr. Patterson replied. "Mrs. Miller, I want you to know that if this is what I suspect it might be, Children's Hospital has one of the best pediatric oncology programs in the country." Oncology. Cancer. The word hit Grace like a physical blow, and she had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing. Tyler, her bright, energetic, curious Tyler, might have cancer. The train sounds from his new room suddenly seemed to come from very far away. "I'll be there tomorrow," she managed to say before ending the call. She stood in the hallway for several moments, trying to process what she'd just heard, while the sounds of Tyler's laughter drifted from his room. When she finally returned, she found Marcus and Tyler building an elaborate traffic jam with toy cars around the train tracks. "Mommy, look," Tyler called out. "We made the cars go through the tunnel." Grace forced a smile, but Marcus was watching her face with the sharp attention she'd noticed he brought to everything. When Tyler became absorbed in creating sound effects for his traffic jam, Marcus moved closer to her. "What's wrong?" he asked quietly. Grace shook her head, not trusting her voice. How could she explain that their careful arrangement, their business deal masquerading as a marriage, had just become irrelevant? That Tyler might be facing something that no amount of money or pretense could fix. "Grace." Marcus's voice was gentle but insistent. "Whatever it is, you're not facing it alone anymore." The kindness in his words nearly broke her resolve. She looked at Tyler, still happily playing with his trains, oblivious to the storm that might be gathering around him. Then she looked at Marcus, this man who had been a stranger a month ago, but who was now legally her husband, practically Tyler's stepfather, and the closest thing to a partner she'd had in years. "Tyler might be sick," she whispered, "really sick." The color drained from Marcus's face and she saw his gaze move immediately to Tyler. "How sick?" "The doctor wants us to see a cancer specialist tomorrow." The word hung between them like a death sentence. Grace watched as Marcus processed this information, his expressions cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked almost like grief. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same authority she'd heard that first day, but now it was directed at fighting for Tyler rather than negotiating a business arrangement. "Then we'll see the best cancer specialist in the country," he said firmly. "Money is no object. Whatever Tyler needs, the best doctors, the best treatment, experimental options if necessary, he'll have it." The fierce protectiveness in Marcus's voice surprised Grace. This was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, a business deal with clear boundaries. But as she watched him look at Tyler with genuine concern, she realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, the lines had begun to blur. And now, with Tyler potentially facing the fight of his young life, their carefully structured pretense was about to be tested in ways none of them could have anticipated. The fluorescent lights of Children's Hospital cast everything in harsh relief as Grace sat in the consultation room, Tyler curled up in her lap while Marcus paced near the window. Sarah Chen, the pediatric hematologist, had been examining Tyler's test results for what felt like hours, though Grace knew it had only been minutes. "The good news," Dr. Chen said finally, setting down Tyler's chart with a gentle smile. Is that Tyler doesn't have cancer? Grace felt her entire body sag with relief, and she buried her face in Tyler's hair, breathing in his familiar scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood innocence. Beside them, Marcus stopped pacing abruptly, his shoulders dropping as tension she hadn't realized he'd been carrying finally released. However, Dr. Chen continued, her expression becoming more serious, Tyler does have a genetic blood disorder called ITP, idiopathic thrombocytopenic purpura. It's manageable, but it will require ongoing treatment and monitoring. What does that mean? Marcus asked, moving closer to Grace and Tyler. Over the past month, Grace had noticed how he'd gradually shortened the physical distance between them during stressful moments, as if his presence could somehow provide protection. Dr. Chen explained that Tyler's immune system was attacking his platelets, making him prone to bruising and bleeding. With proper medication and regular checkups, he could live a completely normal life, but the treatment would be expensive and long-term. The monthly medication costs alone will be around $8,000, Dr. Chen said apologetically. Insurance often covers a portion, but cost isn't a concern, Marcus interrupted firmly. Whatever Tyler needs. As they left the hospital an hour later with a treatment plan and appointment schedule, Grace felt overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Tyler skipped between them, chattering excitedly about the cool machines he'd seen and already planning what he'd tell his new preschool friends about his special blood. I can't believe you're willing to pay for all this, Grace said quietly as they reached Marcus's car. The treatment, the specialist visits, it's going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years. Marcus stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression more serious than she'd ever seen it. Grace, do you really think I'd let Tyler suffer because of money? The question revealed something that Grace had been trying to ignore for weeks. Somewhere between the first awkward dinner at the penthouse and Tyler's bedtime stories that Marcus had begun joining, their arrangement had evolved into something none of them had planned. That evening, after Tyler had fallen asleep, exhausted from the emotional day, Grace found Marcus in his study, staring out at the city lights with a glass of untouched scotch in his hand. Thank you, she said simply, for everything today, for Tyler's treatment, for caring about him. Marcus turned from the window, and in the soft lamplight she could see something vulnerable in his expression. It's more than that, Grace. These past weeks, watching you with Tyler, being part of your daily routines, I've realized something I never expected. Grace's heart began beating faster, though she wasn't sure why. I've fallen in love with you, Marcus continued, his voice quiet but steady. Both of you. This started as an obligation, but somewhere along the way it became real, at least for me. The confession hung between them in the quiet study. Grace felt her carefully constructed walls, the ones she'd built to protect herself from hoping for too much, beginning to crumble. She thought about the small kindnesses she'd noticed, how Marcus always saved the last of the coffee for her in the mornings, the way he'd learned Tyler's bedtime routine without being asked, how he'd started buying the specific brand of yogurt Tyler preferred without any discussion. Marcus, she began, but he held up a hand. I know this complicates everything. I know you didn't sign up for real feelings, and I'm not asking you to feel the same way, but I needed you to know that when this year is over, if you choose to leave, it won't be easy for me. Grace studied his face, seeing past the corporate confidence to the man underneath, someone who'd grown up with wealth but not warmth, who'd learned to manage businesses but not relationships, who'd been strong enough to take care of them but vulnerable enough to admit his feelings. What if I told you, Grace said softly, that I've been falling in love with you too? The surprise that flickered across Marcus's face was genuine and endearing. He set down his scotch and moved closer to her, his eyes searching hers. Are you saying that because you feel grateful? Because you think it's what I want to hear? Grace shook her head, reaching up to touch his cheek. I'm saying it because when Tyler was sick today, the first person I wanted beside me was you. Because you've become part of our family in ways that have nothing to do with contracts or arrangements. Because Tyler asks for you when he has nightmares, and you always come. Marcus leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. I never thought I wanted a family. I was convinced I was too selfish, too focused on business. But Tyler, he's changed everything. And you've shown me what it means to put someone else's needs first. So what happens now? Grace asked. We have 8 more months on the contract. We forget about the contract, Marcus said firmly. We build something real, together, if you'll have me, not as your temporary husband, but as Tyler's stepfather and your actual partner. Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she realized that her father's terrible choice had led to something she'd never dared hope for. A real family, financial security, and love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances. "Tyler's going to be so happy," she said, thinking about her son's innocent questions about whether Marcus would be his forever daddy. "Is that a yes?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying a hint of the uncertainty that made him human rather than just powerful. Instead of answering with words, Grace stood on her tiptoes and kissed him. Not the careful public kisses they'd shared for appearances, but something real and full of promise. When they broke apart, Marcus was smiling with genuine joy. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. From the doorway, a small voice piped up, "Does this mean Marcus is really going to be my daddy?" They turned to find Tyler standing in his pajamas, clutching Peanut and wearing the hopeful expression that had been melting hearts since he learned to smile. Grace and Marcus looked at each other, then back at Tyler. "Yes, buddy?" Marcus said, kneeling down to Tyler's level. "If you'd like me to be." Tyler launched himself into Marcus's arms with the enthusiastic affection of a child who'd found exactly what he'd been hoping for. As Grace watched her son and the man she loved embrace, she realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories began with the most impossible circumstances. 6 months later, Grace stood in the same courthouse where they'd had their first perfunctory ceremony, but this time Tyler was their ring-bearer and doctor. Chen and her husband were among the small gathering of friends who'd come to witness their real wedding. Marcus had insisted on doing it properly, exchanging vows they'd written themselves, promising to love each other not out of obligation but out of choice. As Tyler's laughter echoed through the courthouse halls and Marcus spun Grace around in celebration, she thought about how her father's debt had led to the greatest gift of her life. She'd married a stranger to protect her family, but in the end she'd found her soulmate and given Tyler the father he'd always deserved. Sometimes, Grace reflected as they walked out into the sunshine as a real family, the best beginnings came from the most unexpected places.